So I get the privilege of talking about lamb quality. As you've heard Dr. Winter and Dr. Campbell talk about the importance of nutrition and management and, understanding the maintenance requirements for a breeding animal versus a market animal is key. The main thing here, at least on my end, is where we have to understand that there is a connection between your live management practices on that end product. And in this case, it'd be the lamb cuts, right? The lamb meat. That lamb quality and safety is so critical to what we do, because here's what happens. Once that animal is with me and hanging on a rail, I can't send it back to you to fix. So understanding and having a good grip on what Dr. Winter and Dr. Campbell shared is very, very important. And we want to be proud of what we produce, right? So when we talk about production, I'm not going to get into this, but know that when it comes to my world, in the meat world, the meat industry, meat science, this is what I have to account for. I may not be an expert in all these areas, but I know just enough to be able to share with you and understand the impacts of what all this has on that carcass. So when we're talking about meat quality in lambs, now understand that there are multiple factors involved here, but for the sake of today, and if you want to know more, you got to come to Ohio State and take my classes because we want you here, right? Right, Brady? We're talking about stress handling, and Dr. Winter and Dr. Campbell mentioned environment and bruising. Usually when I share or I talk about quality to my students, the Buckeyes that are in our classrooms, I often remind them that lambs, hogs, cattle, they're all mammals, just like we are. What we like, most likely they like. What we don't like, most likely they don't like. Dr. Winter did a tremendous job explaining that, keeping it very simple and using your common sense. And it might be helpful for you to put yourself in the place of that animal to a point, right? To understand why they may be doing what they're doing, or why are they not drinking out of that brown water? Right? So just simple things like that. So when I talk about quality, at least in lambs, or in any species, understand that when we mention quality, we're talking about the prediction of palatability. In other words, we are estimating or predicting what that consumer is going to go through when it comes to tenderness, flavor, and juiciness. So here we have a set of 4 lambs. Once you start looking into them, or looking at them, you'll notice that there are some differences. Some of them are extremely lean, but light muscled, right? Some of them, there may be 1 or 2 that have that nice plump, heavy, high volume, heavy muscle leg that has that nice outside flare, right? It has that nice curvature. If you look at the sirloin area, we're bulging. This is what I'm starting to look at as soon as I walk into a cooler, and especially if I've judged your carcass shows. One of the first things I'll do is just walk that rail and just kind of get a gist of what I'm dealing with. Because at the end of the day, when we're looking at, or I'm evaluating that ribeye, right? When I rib between the 12th and 13th rib, what I'm interested in is in that meat quality. So that quality would pertain to color, texture, the amount of muscling, right? Because we want more muscle, and the amount of fat. It's a combination, but you have to understand that everything that animal went through is going to impact exactly what I just talked about on that carcass. So there are some quality defects that I'm looking for, and not intentionally, but this is part of the evaluation when it comes to lamb carcass grading. So understand that stress plays a big role in quality defects. Dr. Winter and Dr. Campbell alluded to some things relating to stress. If you stop and think about, if we were to take you to an estranged place, right? A place that you don't know, if you don't know or recognize anyone, you're probably going to stress out a little bit. That's what we call psychological stress, right? These animals go through the same thing as humans. If they're uncomfortable with their environment, or some kind of noise, or maybe someone's laughing too loud at a high pitch, because that stresses me out, chances are that lamb is going to stress. And now sometimes these animals are they're going to play, they're going to fight, they're going to bump into things. How we handle them as well. If we're rough handling them, sometimes if we grab them by that wool to get them to move to point A to point B. That's what I would consider physical stress on the animal. And then let's not forget about nutritional stress. Just like you, if you're not given the right amount of food, right, your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your fats, you're going to start feeling a little different. You're probably going to be sluggish or tired, and your body's going to strive to try to recoup as much nutrients as possible just to maintain that maintenance, right? In order for that animal to grow properly, normal, and above and beyond, right? We really need to understand the basics of nutrition. And this is why my colleagues are here today. It is a case-by-case scenario. There's not a blanket, there's not a one-step-fits-all kind of thing. But this is where I encourage all of you to understand what the role of carbohydrates are, proteins and fats, and then tie that to the growth process, which then leads to the carcass side. Because Dr. Winter, Dr. Campbell, and I, we really are all connected. We really are. And I can't do what I do without them, and vice versa, right? Because we want to make sure that we do our best when we're feeding these animals. So the one thing I will share is that muscle pH is very important in my world, because the muscle pH, or the pH of that muscle, will have a great impact on that overall quality. So even though I have 2 pictures of beef here and 1 pork, it still applies to lamb. So an animal that has plenty of carbohydrate storage, right, in the form of sugar, they go through harvest and they're now a carcass. Chances are 9.9 out of 10 times they're going to result in a cherry red color, right? The color of that meat is going to be normal. That means that the pH is normal. That's exactly what we want. But if we stress that animal for long periods of time, and what defines long periods? Well, that means an hour or more, hours before slaughter. That animal is going to stress excessively, and it's going to utilize a lot of that energy, a lot of those carbohydrates that I just talked about, that energy source, right? The sugars. And the body is not going to be able to drop that pH low enough to normal. And it's going to stay closer to neutral, which is going to be about a 6.2 or higher. And just to let you know, neutral pH is about a 7.3 in skeletal muscle. And that's what that dark picture up in the top right-hand corner looks like. It doesn't look very appealing, does it? This is a food safety concern. This also looks terrible to the consumer. They'll say that the way that we refer to this in meat judging is that it has a low consumer appeal. No one's going to want to buy that. But understand that that's caused by long-term stress. There's more to it, but you got to take my class to learn more of those details. Now, with long-term stress, we also have short-term stress. So just like people, I'm sure we can all identify or think of one person who stresses on a turn of a dime, right? We turn that light switch on and they're already stressing. That's called biology. That doesn't necessarily mean that they've been manhandled, they've been treated poorly. Sometimes biology's at play, and these animals are going to stress just on their own, right? And so, what causes the low pH is short-term stress, but what's happening is that the body is utilizing that energy source. Remember, once again, it's the sugars that comes from that corn, from the carbohydrates, but it's also caused by elevated body temperatures. It's just as if you were asked by your teachers or someone to give a last-minute presentation, and now suddenly you're sweating. That's because your body temperature is now rising. It's the same concept with these animals. But I will say that the picture at the very bottom, that's known as pale, soft, and exudative, commonly found in pork and in poultry. But that does not mean that we cannot find this in beef or in lamb and goat, okay? But it's just more commonly found in pork and poultry, whereas the dark cutters up, the picture up on top, are commonly found in what I like to call the red meats, beef and lamb. But that does not mean we can't find it in pork, because it can happen, okay? So know that muscle pH is very important when it comes to meat quality. But what determines this is everything that happened before slaughter. Okay, that's where the management practices come in. This is how we handle them. And don't forget, we also have biology at play. just to give you some examples of some of the quality defects that we see out in our meat industry. And for those of you who know, and I've judged at your Carcass shows, these are quality defects that I've talked about before. Now, we've been very fortunate to not see very many of these out in the counties at Carcass shows, but know that they can exist and know that they can happen. So if we talk about brute or dark cutters, the picture up on top is an example of what a dark cutter would look like. Now, remember, this is caused by long-term stress. If you look at the picture on the left, it is quite a bit darker than the picture on the right. The one on the right is what we look for. It's that cherry red color in lamb. That tells me that the pH is actually normal, and I'm not going to worry about a food safety issue with this one. I'm not going to worry about a shorter shelf life or anything like that. But the one on the left, I'm gonna think about a little bit more, because one, it's pretty dark in color, and one attributor, there are two factors that will impact color of meat. One is age of animal. The older the animal gets, the darker the color, but then also the quality defect known as dark firm and dry or dark cutters. Below that picture is an example of beef. Now, this is from a friend out at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln that posted this at our American Meat Science Association group. And this was actually sold out in one of the stores in Nebraska, which I'm very surprised to see, because usually the beef packing plants would not sell this. So this may have been an oops on their part. When it comes to bruising, if you notice, the picture on the left shows a bruise up on the sirloin, the rump area along by the neck. Now, this is a prime example of grabbing that animal. And of course, I can just picture this, grabbing that animal behind the neck and right on that rump area and trying to move it to, from point A to point B. Understand that when this happens, now you won't see the bruise, but we will on the carcass side. What happens here is, because that is coagulated blood, right? That's a bruise. On some level, there's damage to the muscle cells there at that point. The meat processor is going to have to cut that out, and it's not going to enter the food chain, because that is a food safety concern. So know that there is money lost here with bruises. Now, if an animal does receive some kind of an impact, right? Let's say that by accident, another animal kicked it, or a pipe fell on it or something, then that impact was very severe. Well, unlike a bruise that will eventually heal itself because the muscle cells are still live and can repair themselves, a callus is not that case. What happens is, if that damage, if that hit is extremely severe and those muscle cells are now dead and they cannot repair themselves, then the proteins in that muscle are now replaced by connective tissue and fat. And that's where you get what we call calluses. Now, what happens here is that there are about 4 stages to calluses. What you see in the picture is pretty severe. That would be a stage 4. And what would happen is we would just trim out what we could and turn that into trim for a ground product. But the main thing here is that, one, we need to be very aware and mindful and just in the know of what these animals are going through. And as I understand, accidents will happen, but we start seeing more of them than it will be of concern. When it comes to the last quality defect known as a blood splash, some of you may have seen this in the meat. It's a real red spots. What happens here is that the animal is very excited and that heart is beating really fast. So what happens is now the blood pressure goes up. And when that blood pressure goes up, if we do not allow that pressure to escape at time of harvest, at time of slaughter, then that pressure is going to escape through the capillaries, and that's what causes the red spots in the meat. This can happen anywhere along the body. It's not commonly found in the ribeye. For some reason, it's commonly found more on the round or the leg or the ham. Center cut slices in pork is common, and in the shoulder. But again, that doesn't mean that we can't find it along the middle meats. This is also a food safety concern, because now we're dealing with blood. And why is that a food safety concern? Because it goes back to pH. The pH of blood is 7.0, and bacteria love a very neutral environment to grow, to replicate. So it is, so going back to the excitement, there is a reason why packing plants allow roughly 45 minutes to an hour and a half of rest time when they receive animals during the unloading process, right before they enter the packing plant. This helps them to calm down. This helps them drink water, put them at ease, which then reduces the incidence of blood splash, okay? So what are we looking for, at least on the carcass side, at least on the meat side? Well, the main thing here is the carcass, the lamb carcass that best combines quality, trimness, and muscling is the one who's going to bring in the most money. So what I have here is a class of intact lamb carcasses, and usually trimness will trump muscling. But in this case, I struggle to justify why that number 4 lamb should go on top if this were your meat jet or your lamb carcass class to evaluate, because when I start taking measurements of back fat and muscling score and body wall thickness, I struggle to justify that number 4 is going to yield or is going to produce a lot of sellable product. In other words, a lot of muscle mass to sell as meat. He may be leaner, but when it comes to muscle mass, he's not quite there. However, I do think that that number 3 is blue he is, meaning that's how thin that fat is. He's not carrying much fat. I'm willing to bet he has 1/10 of back fat just by looking at that carcass. And he actually has really good muscling shape. Now, remember, I believe Dr. Campbell was talking about muscle and shape. Remember that muscle gives shape, fat does not. So the more shape that I can see, more so of like an hourglass shape, that tells me a lot more about what to expect from that carcass. Because then once I evaluate the carcass as is, then I'm thinking in my head, prediction is, well, now what are those chops going to look like? The rib chops, the loin chops, right? The sirloin chops. What is that going to look like? And again, we want the one that has less fat and more muscle, because we tend to enjoy more muscle than we do fat, right? That's what I have for you when it comes to the meat quality side of lambs.